guys, Ed Watson here. I have so many fond high school memories of the Commodore PET. My dad was and still is an avid computer scientist who happened to be the computer science head at my school. I remember Dad bringing a PET 4032 home for summer holidays one year, and from then on I was hooked. Shortly after that, we pulled the trigger on a gorgeous SuperPet of our own with a beautiful companion CBM 8050 floppy drive. Oh yeah.
Look at it. All those languages at the ready to start your programming adventures. Just toggle a side switch and away you go. Waterloo Basic, Fortran, Pascal, COBOL. Man, it gives me goosebumps just looking at it now. This thing was as popular as balls back in the day. There were times when physical violence ensued in our high school hallways, with nerdy cats rushing to get into the computer room first to use the only SuperPet. I mean, we had 8032s, 4032s, all connected together with a Muppet to 8050 disk drives, and these guys would still let the punches fly to get to that SuperPet. And if you guys are watching this, you know who you are.
Anyway, I happened to see that there was a project out there on the interwebs where someone created a miniature version of the PET itself, and it works. Well, that was enough to get me hooked, so I decided to dive in and build my own. And here it is. I did have some challenges, but I finally got this little guy up and running. So without further ado, let's get to it.
The first thing we will need is the Raspberry Pi itself. I went with a kit from CanaKit, which includes the Pi 3 B+, power supply, an inline power switch, a 32GB SD card, HDMI cable, some heat sinks, and a project case. Next is a 3.5-inch HDMI monitor to act as the PET's display. A 20cm HDMI flat cable. Note the orientation of the 90-degree end here. I ordered a single upward by accident as I didn't know any better at the time. It works, but only just. What you want to get here is a single downward. An amplifier, a speaker, a micro USB panel mount extension cable, breadboard jumper wires, toggle switches, screws, hobby magnets for the case closing mechanism, and finally some labels. I got transparent ones that work out quite nicely. Now let me show you the different parts that we need to 3D print. Base for the Raspberry Pi 3, the body shell, the monitor box body, the monitor frame, the monitor box front, the monitor box rear cap, the monitor stand, the monitor frame HDMI display bracket, and finally, the keyboard. I'm not going to show printing all the parts, because you may find yourself slipping into a state of madness after watching hours of this stuff. Something I do want to cover though is the right and wrong ways to orient the model before printing it. This is something to get used to when printing in 3D. 3D printing is not like printing out a Word document. One has to familiarize themselves with the slicer software to position the model properly in order to minimize support structures. 3D printers work by depositing layer over layer of thermoplastics to create a 3D object. In this method, each new layer must be supported by the layer beneath it. If your model has an overhang which is not supported by anything below, you need to add additional 3D printing support structures to ensure a successful print. Support structures are a necessary evil in 3D printing. On one hand, they're necessary for models with overhangs or bridges. On the other hand, they increase material costs, add more post-processing work, and can damage the model's surface. Getting the 3D printing support structures right is a very important aspect of 3D printing. Let's look at the monitor stand in the slicer. Notice the light blue areas? These support structures are required because the upper part of the frame has a bridge which is not supported by anything below it. This is what that part ended up looking like after it was printed. Notice the support material broken out on the right. I had a particular problem with the body shell model here. Because I wanted the best surface result for this piece, I printed it with the top facing up. This will give a nice surface. However, look at all that support material. This all has to be removed after. Well, I'm here to tell you that it can't be done this way. I don't care what Michael Jackson says. I raised my voice to the max and still ended up with this mess. Time to start again by turning the model on its back to allow the sides to build on themselves. The only issue with this approach is that the slanted keyboard area will need to be supported and will need to be broken away without damaging the top surface. I was able to remove the supports without too much trouble. It just needs a lot of time and patience. With the use of some fine sandpaper and model putty, it turned out perfectly. We have 3D parts that are both black and white. The black parts don't require any paint, as they're already great the way they are. The white parts are a little too white and need to be retroized. To accomplish this, each of the white parts are first sanded and then primed with this Rust-Oleum primer, which is suitable for plastics. After the primer dries, we finish it off with Rust-Oleum's Heirloom White to give it that vintage Commodore look. Lorenzo provides several front logos for each of the PET models as part of his original project. I used the SuperPet logo because that's what we had at home, so that fits perfectly. A serial number label is also provided, but I modified it with the Model 9000 SuperPet, gave it a North American power rating, a serial number of SP007 to pay homage to James Bond. Yes, Moneypenny. And finally, I made the thing in Canada, so it should say so, eh? I then merged all of the required labels to one sheet, printed them all on a transparent Avery label sheet. You can follow one of two methods when installing the RetroPie software to the microSD card. The first way is to go to the retropie.org.uk site and download the RetroPie image appropriate for your hardware. Once downloaded, use a utility program called Etcher to take that image and burn it to the microSD card. Obviously at this point, you must have the microSD card mounted on your system for this to work. That's it! Once complete, you'll be left with a bootable microSD card with RetroPie Buster installed. The second way, and the easiest in my opinion, is to use the Raspberry Pi Imager program. This program is a quick and easy way to install various ready-to-use operating systems to your microSD card. First, choose the OS you want to install. In our case, this is under the Emulation and Game OS section. Choose RetroPie and then the specific version required for your hardware. Next, choose Storage and select the microSD card that is mounted on your machine. Then click on Write and you're done. That was bloody easy, wasn't it? At this point, you can insert the SD card into the Raspberry Pi and boot. Don't make the initial mistake I did by plugging the SD card using the USB adapter into the USB slot in the back of the Pi. This had me hung up for a hot minute when the OS failed to load, citing kernel panic errors everywhere. With the microSD card inserted properly, boot the Pi. When RetroPie boots for the first time, it asks to configure controllers for Emulation Station. This could be done with either a game controller or a keyboard. In my case, I did both. Let's assume you have a controller. I have one that's like this. Press a button to map that button to a defined function. To skip a function, hold down the button for more than a second, and it will bypass the function and go to the next. At this point, RetroPie is set up and ready for the next step. This step is to install Vice. Vice is an emulator that executes programs intended for the 8-bit Commodore computer lineup. Vice emulates Commodore 64s, Commodore 128s, VIC-20s, Plus 4s, CBM2s, and all the PET models, 2001, 3000 series, 4000 series, 8000 series, and finally, the 9000 series. Connect the Raspberry Pi to your network, either with a wired or wireless connection. Under the RetroPie configuration, choose the RetroPie Setup menu. Now let me freeze the video for a sec here. You see that entry S update RetroPie setup script? You want to run this first to be sure that the scripts you're about to run are up to date. Once that's done, go to Manage Packages, then to Manage Optional Packages. Then scroll down and look for Vice. As you can see here, I already have it installed, so I won't go through this again. You want to install Vice from source, as that will give you the latest and greatest code compilations. However, it takes a dog's age to finish, so you have to be patient. The other option is to install from a precompiled binary, which does nip along smartly, but you may not get the most up-to-date code. Once the install is complete, reboot the Pi and you will see that it comes up with the Commodore 64 as the default emulator. With the Raspberry Pi still connected to the network, you will be able to see some default Samba shares on your computer. Connect to RetroPie using your File Explorer or Finder under Network RetroPie. You will see one of the directory names is called ROMs. Under that ROMs directory, you will see subdirectories for each of the emulated systems. Simply drag and drop a ROM, which is really just a game file or a program file, into the emulator that you're interested in. Let's put a couple of games in the C64 ROMs directory and reboot Emulation Station. Now let's see if this thing works with Jumpman. At this point, I'll show you how to enable SSH so you can use Terminal to remote log in to your Pi from your computer rather than using Pi itself to modify OS level files. As an aside, you can access the Linux shell locally by pressing F4 at the RetroPie menu. Click on the Raspberry Config option in the Raspberry Pi configuration menu. This will bring up a character-based menu called RetroPie Software Configuration Tool. Click on the interface options and select the Enable Disable Remote Command Line Access using SSH option. First, you want to find out what IP address the Raspberry Pi is using. To do this, click on the Show IP option in the RetroPie configuration menu. This will bring up another character-based menu showing the current IP address of the Raspberry Pi. Open a terminal session on your computer. On Mac OS, Terminal is built in, providing text-based access to the operating system. Type SSH space pi, @ and then the IP address you noted earlier. The default password is raspberry. Type exit to end the session. The files we need to configure live in a directory /etc/emulation station. This directory is tricky to get to as it involves doing a bit of permission stuff in terminal, plus any changes that you make to it will get overwritten if you update RetroPie. So we're going to make a copy of them, both to make it easier to access and to avoid being overwritten. There are two different backups we're going to take, one for the es_systems.config file and another for the themes directory. This is where we get to use SSH that we set up earlier in the video. Connect to your Pi using SSH. Type the following command into your SSH client. This makes a copy of the file that is accessible from the Samba share, which are the same shares we used when copying ROMs from your computer. Now let's do the same for the themes directory. Type this command into your SSH client. Okay, let's locate the es_systems.config file. It's going to be in the configs directory under all/emulation station. The themes directory should also be in the same place. Open the file in your text editor. It should look something like this. We want to add a completely new system for the PET. I basically copied the C64 section and created a new one for the PET, as you can see here in the blue highlight. You'll note that each system is surrounded by system tags. Within the system tags, there are several sections. Speaking of themes, you'll also need to create a theme for the PET. Go to Configs, All, Emulation Station, Themes, and then the name of your theme. Your theme will be Carbon if you haven't installed any new themes at this point. Under the Themes directory, there should be a directory for each system. The easiest thing to do is to make a copy of one of these directories, like the C64 directory for instance, and make a template for the PET. If you're using the default Carbon theme, you can just make a new logo called system.svg in the art folder. This is the main logo that sits on the menu bar itself. There is also a file called controller.svg that maps to a larger image above the menu. If this doesn't exist, then the image simply doesn't show up, so it's purely optional. We should be done. Reboot the Pi and we should have PET emulation. Because the original PETs had their connections on the back, we need to route the power connections and power switch on our PET to the back as well. There's not too much in terms of wiring other than having to make a wiring harness to allow for the rear connections. To do this, cut the USB extender cable and expose the wires on both the panel mount side and the male micro USB side. Note that we don't need the green and white data wires for this, so there's no need to do anything further with those. Solder the black ground wires back together again and use shrink tubing to prevent shorting. Then solder the red wire ends to the contacts on the switch. Now because the original PET had such outstanding sound, we're also giving our PET a small amplifier and speaker so you can hear those dulcet square wave tones in all their glory. You will need to butcher a mini jack cable for the connection from the Pi's audio out plug to the input terminals of the amplifier. When you're done, you should have something that looks like this. Doesn't it all look nice when it's installed? But does it work?
Sorry, Ed. There are plenty of consolation prizes for you in the back.
But more on that in a minute. Next, we want to test the 3.5-inch HDMI monitor. I used the breadboard wires to extend the GPIO pins from the Pi to the monitor. Obviously, we'll have to connect the HDMI cable to the Pi and monitor as well. We then mount the monitor to the monitor frame bracket using 2 small screws. This leaves the HDMI ports exposed. We can finally glue the monitor frame to the monitor body. One thing to note here, we are actually mounting the 3.5-inch display upside down in the case. So when you turn it on, the screen text will be upside down as well. This can be fixed through a software change. The config.txt file found in root's boot directory is analogous to a conventional PC's BIOS, where all the Pi's configuration is located. To flip the display 180 degrees, add the display_HDMI_rotate command, as I have highlighted in blue here. Let's get back to the issues surrounding the power switch and the USB extender wiring. Everything seemed to go quite nicely when I powered it on for the first time. Then I'd sporadically get a lightning bolt in the top right corner of the screen. I later learned that this was a sign that the Pi wasn't getting enough voltage. This had me flummoxed, since I was using a decent 5-volt power source. Why is it signaling low voltage? To make a long story short, I ended up ordering the official Pi 3 Model B Plus power supply and continued to have these errors. I then tried bypassing the wiring I made and plugged the Pi straight into the power supply, and it worked like a charm. The Pi 3 Model B Plus can draw as little as 500 milliamps or up to 1.2 amps. This power supply is rated at 2.5 amps, so what gives? It turns out it's not the power supply at all, but how you connect to the power supply. This is where a little high school physics comes into play. Man, it's too bad I didn't pay more attention back then. Ohm's law states that current through a conductor between 2 points is directly proportional to the voltage across those same 2 points. The ratio of voltage to current is called resistance. This is where we get into material sciences like wire gauges and specifications. I'm not going to go into all the math associated with proving this thing, but it appears the wire gauge in the USB extender that I'm using is too small. This causes resistance, allowing for a small drop in voltage by the time the power hits the Pi. I still wanted to power the PET with the micro USB and switch in the back, but also need to keep the power at the Pi above the threshold so not to generate these under voltage errors. Well, it looks like it's time to phone a friend. Well, actually my dad. He recommended that I use a buck converter. A buck converter is a step-down DC to DC converter that steps down voltage from its input supply to its output or load. This was a great alternative since I have several power supplies kicking around that I can repurpose. In this case, I used a 12-volt 3-amp supply with a barrel jack to micro USB adapter. The buck converter has a potentiometer on it that when turned counterclockwise will step down the voltage. Here we need to step it down from 12 volts to 5 volts. Since I was essentially ripping out the existing wiring, it meant I needed to find a supply for the 5-volt amplifier. Both 5-volt GPIO pins were already being used by the monitor, so I decided to use a spare 3.3 volt pin, which is pin 17, and a ground pin, pin 9. Here's what it looks like installed, and it works perfectly with no undervoltage problems whatsoever. To put the icing on the cake, I started messing around with themes and game scraping. I found a theme out there that some clever chap created based on the original Amiga workbench screens. I figured this falls in line with the whole Commodore vibe, so I installed it and it looks fabulous. I also scraped all the installed games to put game art and details in to give it that professional retro look. Now it's time to play PET Space Invaders. Man, this really brings me back. I haven't played this thing in over 40 years. I was playing this at home when all those other suckers, pardon me, friends were spending their hard-earned quarters playing the same thing in the local burger joints. I hope you enjoyed this video documentary of the SuperPet Mini build. It was a lot of fun and a learning experience to boot. Let's face it, you're never too old to learn. Am I right? My next project will be a rebuild of our original MSI 8088 computer, so stay tuned for that one. Until then, I'm Ed Watson, signing off. See you next time. Cheers.